The silence before the storm, the modern man's inner void. Every great story begins in darkness, not the kind that comes from the absence of light, but the kind that comes from the absence of direction, the kind of darkness that swallows the modern man quietly, invisibly, while he stares at the glow of a screen, mistaking stimulation for purpose and noise for meaning. He wakes up not with intention, but with interruption. The alarm screams, notifications buzz, and before his eyes have even adjusted to the morning light, his mind has already been hijacked, pulled into a world of comparisons, opinions, and artificial urgency. He scrolls, he checks, he reacts, yet deep inside something remains untouched. A small, still voice that whispers, "You are not really here." This is the paradox of our age. Connection everywhere, yet no real contact. Men once wandered deserts, climbed mountains, or crossed oceans to find meaning. Now they open apps. They no longer seek truth, they consume it in bite-sized doses, packaged to keep them numb. Every conversation becomes performance. Every opinion becomes armor. He learns to smile when he's empty, to joke when he's breaking, to project confidence while drowning in quiet confusion. The world applauds his image while his soul starves beneath it. We call this progress, but perhaps it is the most elegant form of slavery humanity has ever created. A slavery of comfort, a bondage of validation. In the past, chains were made of iron. Now they're made of dopamine. Every ping, every like, every small acknowledgement keeps him tethered to a false sense of belonging. A networked illusion that whispers, "You are seen, therefore you exist." But deep down, he knows being seen is not the same as being known. He has built his entire identity in the reflection of others' expectations. And so, when he is finally alone, he feels nothing but panic, because solitude strips away the mirrors, and all that's left is the self he never learned to face. Silence has become unbearable. Stillness feels like death. And yet this very discomfort, this unease in the quiet, is where true awakening begins, because what he calls boredom is often the first encounter with his unfiltered self. What he calls loneliness is the first invitation to rediscover what he has lost. The man who cannot be alone will always remain a follower, chained to approval, haunted by the opinions of others. He will move with the herd, speak their words, desire their desires, never realizing he has mistaken conformity for connection. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of distraction, another truth waits. Before a man can lead, he must first learn to walk alone, not out of arrogance or pride, but out of necessity. For solitude is not punishment. It is purification. It is in solitude that he confronts the question that the world drowns out. Who am I when no one is watching? Nietzsche once said, "Become who you are." But how can a man become anything if he never steps away long enough to see what he has become? Modern life rewards compliance, not contemplation. It praises constant engagement, but punishes stillness. Yet every leader, every visionary, every soul who has ever reshaped the world began by stepping away from it. They all face the same void, the same silence that modern men now fear. This section, this beginning, is not about isolation, it's about initiation, because solitude, when chosen, is not emptiness. It is the fertile soil where strength, vision, and authenticity take root. Before a man can stand before others with truth, he must first stand before himself, without distraction, without applause, without escape, Only then can he begin the real journey. Only then can he see that walking alone was never the curse. It was always the path. The ancient rite, solitude as a crucible of transformation, long before skyscrapers replaced mountains and screens replaced stars, solitude was sacred. It was not something to escape, but something to endure, a necessary trial on the path to becoming whole. Every civilization, every culture that sought to understand what it means to be human, recognized a simple truth. A man who has never been alone has never truly been alive. In ancient tribes, young men were not handed manhood, they earned it. They were sent into the wilderness, stripped of comfort and company, to face the vast silence of the world and the terror of their own mind. No guidance, no applause, no one to rescue them. Only the wind, the cold, and the unrelenting presence of themselves. They called it an initiation, a ritual of separation from the tribe, so that when they returned, they would no longer be boys acting out strength, but men who had discovered its source within. In that solitude, something transformative happened. Fear turned to awareness. Doubt turned to clarity. They came back not because they conquered the wilderness, but because they conquered themselves. Compare this to the modern man, born into convenience, shielded from silence, and taught that comfort is safety. He grows older, but not deeper. His hardships are digital. His struggles, emotional performances. He has never been initiated into his own depth because the modern world has erased the wilderness, both outside and within. Yet, the call remains. That ancient pull to step away from the tribe still echoes in the heart of every man who feels restless despite his success, lonely despite his connections, lost despite having everything he was told would make him happy. Solitude is not a retreat, it is a return to the unfiltered reality of one's own existence. When Buddha left the palace, it was not rebellion, it was revelation. He walked away from luxury to discover truth. When Christ wandered into the desert, it was not escape, it was confrontation. 40 days of silence that would forge the clarity to guide others. When Nietzsche walked alone in the Swiss Alps, he was not isolating himself. He was giving birth to ideas the world was not yet ready to hear. Every visionary, every leader who reshaped civilization first stepped into solitude, because only there, away from the noise of imitation, can one hear the faint but powerful voice of individuality. Solitude is a crucible. It burns away everything false. It exposes the layers of social conditioning, the illusions of identity built from approval and expectation. It strips a man down to his essence, to what remains when all masks are gone. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey of integrating one's shadow, of becoming a unified and authentic self rather than a collection of borrowed personas. He believed that until a man withdraws from the collective and confronts the darkness within, he remains fragmented, half alive, half known. The ancients understood this instinctively. That's why their heroes always walked into the wild before they ever returned to the world. In myth, this phase is known as the descent, the time when the hero faces the abyss, the unknown, and the terror of isolation. Joseph Campbell called it the call to adventure, that moment when the ordinary world no longer satisfies, and the individual must step beyond the familiar into the transformative unknown. In that abyss, something miraculous happens. The self is reborn. The man who once sought validation begins to discover conviction. The one who feared being unseen starts to value being real. Solitude transforms dependence into self-mastery. It replaces the question, what do they think of me, with what do I think of myself? It replaces performance with presence, noise with understanding, and fear with quiet authority. To walk alone, then, is not to be abandoned by the world. It is to return to one's rightful place within it. The ancients knew this. They didn't see solitude as isolation, but as initiation, the necessary exile of the soul before it can rejoin society with wisdom and strength. Our modern tragedy is that this ritual no longer exists. We have comfort instead of courage, distraction instead of direction. But for those few who still feel the ancient call, who sense there is something sacred waiting beyond the noise, the path remains open. For every man there comes a moment when he must leave the tribe, not because he despises it, but because he can no longer find himself within it. And when he returns, calmer, clearer, no longer seeking approval, the world will recognize in him what it always craved but never understood: quiet strength. For the man who has faced himself needs no validation. He has already passed through the fire, the war within, facing the shadow. When the noise fades and the distractions dissolve, what remains is not peace, but confrontation. Solitude is not a calm meadow, it is a battlefield. It is the place where a man finally meets the one adversary he has been avoiding all his life: himself. At first, the silence feels liberating. No expectations, no opinions, no one to perform for. But soon, the silence begins to whisper. It speaks in forgotten memories, buried regrets, and long suppressed fears. It reminds him of every compromise he made to fit in, every truth he swallowed to avoid conflict, every dream he abandoned because it didn't align with what others expected of him. In solitude, the mask begins to crack, and beneath it he sees something he doesn't recognize, or perhaps something he always knew was there. This is the shadow, as Carl Jung described it, the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or hide from the world. The insecurities, the jealousy, the anger, the hidden desires, the unfulfilled potential, all the fragments we pretend don't exist. The shadow is not evil, it is simply the truth we're afraid to face. And when a man is finally alone, there is nowhere left to run from it. The modern man spends his life running, not from others, but from himself. He works endlessly, consumes endlessly, speaks endlessly, because stillness exposes him, and exposure is painful. To sit in silence and realize you are not who you thought you were is to experience a kind of death, the death of illusion. But it is only through this death that rebirth becomes possible. Every man must at some point descend into his own underworld. The myths of every civilization echo this truth. In ancient Greece, Orpheus descended into Hades to reclaim what was lost. In Christianity, Christ faced the desert before his destiny. In Buddhism, Siddhartha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, wrestling with temptation and fear until enlightenment dawned. Each story is the same in essence. To lead others, one must first conquer the chaos within. But conquering the shadow is not domination, it is integration. The goal is not to destroy the darker parts of oneself, but to understand them, to make peace with them, to learn from them. The anger that once controlled you becomes your strength. The fear that once paralyzed you becomes your awareness. The pain that once broke you becomes your depth. Jordan Peterson calls this voluntary confrontation with chaos, the conscious decision to face suffering head-on, rather than letting it control you from the shadows. Because every unexamined fear grows in the dark, and every denied emotion becomes a quiet tyrant. Most men never face this battle. They distract, they deflect, They numb themselves through endless stimulation. They fear silence because it reveals the uncomfortable truth. They are not yet whole, but the few who endure, who resist the urge to escape, discover something extraordinary. Beneath the chaos lies order. Beneath the pain lies clarity. It is as if solitude digs into the soil of the soul, unearthing everything that was buried until what remains is raw, unfiltered truth. The man who walks this path begins to understand that his demons were never enemies. They were messengers. Each fear carried a lesson. Each failure contained direction. Each wound was a doorway to wisdom. Plato once told the story of men chained in a cave, mistaking shadows for reality. To step out of that cave, to face the blinding light of truth, is to endure agony. The eyes burn, the mind resists, and the heart longs for the familiar darkness. But once the eyes adjust, the man realizes that what he once called reality was only reflection, that true vision requires pain, so too does solitude. It burns at first, it disorients, it destroys, but it also reveals. The man who endures his solitude long enough begins to see the architecture of his own mind, the patterns, the illusions, the false identities. He learns that leadership is not about commanding others, but about commanding oneself. He learns that confidence is not built through praise, but through presence. And he learns that authenticity is born only from the ashes of falsehood. Nietzsche warned, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster." But he also understood that a man who never fights his inner monsters becomes their slave. The war within is dangerous. It can consume the weak, but it refines the strong. When a man finally integrates his shadow, when he no longer fears his darkness, he becomes powerful in a way that is almost invisible. Not loud, not boastful, but grounded, centered, untouchable. This is the quiet authority of the man who has faced himself. He no longer needs validation because he has already been tested in the only arena that matters, the one within. And when that war ends, not in victory, but in understanding, something remarkable happens. The chaos that once ruled him becomes his ally. The silence that once frightened him becomes his sanctuary. And in that stillness, a new kind of man emerges. Not one who escapes his demons, but one who walks beside them. For only a man who has made peace with his shadow can ever stand in the light without trembling. The rebirth, emerging with clarity and authority. When the storm finally subsides, the silence returns, but this time it feels different. It is no longer the suffocating silence of emptiness, but the sacred stillness of understanding. The man who once trembled in solitude now begins to see clearly, not because the world has changed, but because he has. There is a strange calm that follows the war within. It's as if the fragments of his being, once scattered across years of distraction, denial, and dependency, have quietly begun to realign. What remains is not the same man who began the journey. It is someone stripped bare, but stronger, softer, yet unbreakable. This is the rebirth. It doesn't happen with a sudden revelation or a dramatic moment. It arrives slowly, like dawn, subtle, gradual but undeniable. He starts to notice how differently he moves through the world now. The noise that once overwhelmed him seems distant, like echoes in another room. The opinions of others no longer pierce his peace. The validation he once craved feels meaningless. He no longer seeks to fill every silence or justify every choice. He no longer measures himself by comparison. He no longer runs from the quiet, because the quiet has become his teacher. In solitude, he has learned something the world forgot: clarity. Clarity that cuts through the fog of modern life, through the endless marketing of happiness, through the illusion of progress, through the voices telling him who he should be. Clarity that whispers the simplest of truths. Nothing real can be threatened, and nothing false can survive. Through that truth, he rediscovers his authority, not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that commands respect through presence. Real authority has nothing to do with control. It is born from alignment. When a man's words, thoughts, and actions are no longer at war with each other, such a man carries an invisible weight. He doesn't need to raise his voice. His silence speaks for him. He doesn't need to convince anyone. His authenticity does it for him. He doesn't chase recognition. Recognition finds him naturally, because people can sense when a man has faced himself. They can feel the difference between one who is pretending and one who is grounded in truth. He has replaced reaction with reflection. He no longer responds to life as if it's happening to him. He participates in it consciously, and in that awareness, he discovers what leadership truly means. Leadership is not charisma. It's not about popularity or performance. It is clarity under pressure. It is the ability to remain composed when everything around you falls apart. It is to see clearly when others are blinded by emotion or fear. That calm, that composure comes only from solitude. From having already faced worse storms within. The world cannot shake a man who has learned to be still. He has already met chaos in its purest form, his own mind, and survived. So when chaos visits again, he welcomes it as an old companion. This kind of strength is rare in the modern age because it cannot be faked. It cannot be taught through courses or copied from others. It must be lived. It must be earned in the silence no one sees. We see glimpses of this truth throughout history. Marcus Aurelius, writing Meditations during war, surrounded by death, yet guided by wisdom born from solitude. Nelson Mandela, who entered prison a man of anger and emerged a man of peace, not because he was spared suffering, but because he faced it without losing himself. Even Steve Jobs, known for his intensity, often spoke of the necessity of stepping away, of clearing one's mind to see what truly matters. Each of them emerged from isolation not broken, but distilled, purified of excess, anchored in purpose. The man who has been reborn through solitude doesn't return to society as an outcast, but as a stabilizer. He becomes the one others turn to when confusion reigns. His presence is a mirror that reflects truth, often without words. He has no need to impose himself on others, because his authority doesn't come from dominance, but from understanding. He leads not through command, but through example. The paradox is this: the more a man learns to stand alone, the more capable he becomes of standing for others. He no longer leads to prove himself. He leads because he can't help but embody what others seek. Clarity, calm, conviction. In him, leadership is no longer a performance. It is a byproduct of authenticity. He has realized that control is an illusion and that real power lies in surrender. Surrendering to truth, to impermanence, to the quiet rhythm of existence. The world today confuses leadership with noise, with bravado, visibility, and influence. But true leadership is silent. It begins not on a stage, but in solitude. It doesn't seek followers. It creates thinkers. It doesn't manipulate. It illuminates. And this illumination, this quiet power, only comes to the man who has endured his own darkness and walked out with light in his hands. He no longer fears solitude because he understands it as the source of all clarity. He no longer fears failure because he knows it's the crucible of strength. He no longer fears being misunderstood because he no longer lives to be understood. The reborn man has finally learned what freedom feels like. Not the freedom to do whatever he wants, but the freedom to no longer be enslaved by what doesn't matter. He has discovered that solitude was never isolation, it was alignment, it was never exile, it was evolution, and now having been stripped of illusion and remade in silence, he stands ready not to rule but to serve truth, to guide others, and to live from the unshakable peace that only solitude can give. The return, leading without needing to lead. Every man who has walked through the wilderness eventually returns, but he does not return as the same man who left. He walks differently now, slower, more deliberate, with the calm certainty of someone who no longer seeks direction because he is direction. The world around him hasn't changed. The noise still hums, the crowds still chase, the chaos still shouts for attention, but he has. He moves through the same world, yet experiences it from an entirely different height. For he has learned the paradox that only solitude reveals. To lead, one must first stop trying to lead. To guide others, one must stop trying to control them. And to influence the world, one must no longer be of it. The man who returns from solitude carries no crown, no title, no demand for recognition. His power is quiet, his authority effortless. He no longer measures his value by how many follow him, but by how many he helps awaken. He understands now that leadership was never about command. It was about clarity. It was never about telling others what to do. It was about embodying what is true. Those who see him may not even realize what draws them in. It is not his words, but his energy, not his confidence, but his centeredness. There is something unspoken about him, a gravity that others feel, though they cannot name it. It is the presence of a man who no longer needs anything from the world, and that paradoxically is why the world now listens to him. He leads without trying, influences without effort, teaches without preaching, because his very being has become a reflection of the lessons solitude taught him: authenticity, restraint, and self-possession. He no longer speaks to impress, but to express. He no longer acts to be seen, but because something within him demands action. His purpose no longer comes from ambition, but from alignment. In the ancient texts, there is an idea found in the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. When the best leader's work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." This is the essence of his return. He doesn't impose himself upon others. He empowers them to see their own strength. He doesn't crave loyalty. He inspires independence. He doesn't rule over others. He walks beside them, quietly, intentionally, as a living reminder of what freedom looks like. And yet he often remains misunderstood, because the modern world still equates leadership with noise, with visibility, authority, and dominance. But he knows better now. He knows that those who speak the loudest often lead the least. He has seen through the illusion that power must be performed. True power is presence, silent, unwavering, unseen, yet undeniable. He no longer reacts to chaos with panic. He meets it with composure. He no longer seeks control over circumstances. He seeks control over himself. And in that self-mastery, others find something they can trust, something that feels rare in a world addicted to pretension. He leads without needing to lead, because he has transcended the very need for recognition. He has outgrown the fragile ego that depends on approval applause, and authority. He no longer draws strength from the world's affirmation. He draws it from the stillness he found within. People follow him, not because they are told to, but because something in them recognizes truth when they see it. The man who has walked alone does not crave followers. He wants others to walk their own paths. He knows solitude cannot be inherited, it must be experienced, so he points others toward their own wilderness, not with instruction but with example. And as he moves through life, calm, grounded, free, the world begins to change around him, not because he commands it, but because his very existence challenges it. His silence becomes a protest against noise. His peace becomes rebellion against chaos. His authenticity becomes resistance against conformity. He has become what the ancient mystics called a man of being, one who no longer does in order to become, but is because he has already found. And in this way he fulfills the ultimate paradox of leadership. He leads best when he forgets to lead. He inspires most when he stops trying to inspire. He becomes most powerful when he no longer seeks power. He has returned from solitude, not to stand above others, but to walk among them, as proof that peace is possible, that clarity is real, and that leadership begins the moment one stops pretending to be anything other than themselves. For the man who has walked alone has already conquered the hardest path, himself, and in doing so he no longer needs to lead, because he has already shown the way. The final message, the sacred solitude. In the end, all roads lead back to silence. The noise fades, the applause dies, the battles end, and what remains is the quiet hum of existence itself. The man who has walked alone finally understands that solitude was never a chapter in his life. It was the foundation of it. Solitude is not the enemy of connection, it is its prerequisite, because only a man who has found peace within himself can bring peace to others. Only one who has faced his own darkness can guide others through theirs. Only one who no longer needs validation can love without condition. The world teaches us to fear aloneness, to see it as emptiness, as failure, as proof that something is wrong. But solitude is not absence, it is presence intensified. It is the meeting place between the self and the soul, between noise and meaning, between illusion and truth. When a man finally embraces it, he realizes that he was never truly alone, only distracted from the deeper companionship of his own consciousness. Every great revolution, every great idea, every act of creation has begun the same way, with one person alone thinking deeply. The philosophers who questioned the nature of reality, the prophets who redefined morality, the artists who reimagined beauty, all began with solitude as their teacher, because solitude sharpens the mind, it clarifies the heart, it separates the noise of the crowd from the whisper of intuition. It is in solitude that the man learns to listen, not to the world, but to what moves beneath it. This is the sacred truth modern life hides. Solitude is not isolation from humanity. It is initiation into it. A man who has learned to be alone is no longer ruled by the crowd. He can engage with the world without being consumed by it. He can lead without losing himself. In a society that glorifies constant communication, the man who chooses silence becomes a rebel. In a culture that rewards conformity, the man who listens inwardly becomes dangerous, because he cannot be easily manipulated, cannot be bought, cannot be swayed by the tides of public opinion. He belongs fully to himself, and that, in a world built on dependency, is the ultimate act of freedom. So let this be the final reminder. Solitude is not withdrawal from life. It is a return to it. It is not a rejection of others. It is a reconnection with truth. It is not loneliness. It is liberation. Because the man who has learned to walk alone no longer walks in fear. He no longer seeks direction. He is direction. He no longer runs from silence. He is silence. He has become both the question and the answer, both the path and the destination. And as the world spins endlessly in noise and confusion, he stands unmoved, the quiet center of his own existence. Only the man who has learned to walk alone, the voice whispers in the end, can ever walk ahead.